Okay, folks. This talk is called How GraphQL Empowers Your Product Manager and Designer by yours truly here, Jeff Auriemma. Speaking of which, hi, I'm Jeff. I go by he and him pronouns. I'm an engineering manager at Apollo GraphQL. The team I serve maintains Apollo Client, Apollo iOS, and Apollo Kotlin. A little later in the evening, you'll hear from Anthony Miller, who is the lead maintainer on Apollo iOS. Shout out, Anthony. I am based in Connecticut, but I did start my tech career in Chicago. I am the father of three, master of none. In my free time, I like to make coffee and espresso. I like to bake things, including deep dish pizza, and I like to go on hikes. I do want to add that critical feedback on this talk. I really do appreciate it. And you can find me on social media. You could tell when I made these slides because it was still called Twitter at Jeff Auriemma. And you can also give Threads a try at jeff.auriemma. So I look forward to hearing from you. Here's what I hope you'll take away from this talk. First, I'll cover some common themes I've noticed in the way engineers discuss GraphQL. From there, as the title of this talk implies, I'll talk about our non-engineering colleagues. There is no I in GraphQL after all. And I'll cover some concrete examples that illustrate my point in more detail. I hope this all builds to the outcome of this audience having a few more ways to talk about GraphQL to a broader audience. GraphQL isn't for everyone or every team, but since this is a GraphQL meetup, I'm assuming at least most of us like GraphQL and want to see it thrive. One of the ways it does that is through adoption. GraphQL spec is great. If you haven't yet, do take an afternoon to read the entire thing. It's not as long as you might expect. It's open source, and the GraphQL Working Group Technical Steering Committee meetings are open to all. Developer experience and tooling are top-notch. Many of the affordances we take for granted as developers these days grew out of the GraphQL community years ago, and it's still getting better all the time. I like the platform and language neutral type system. Normalized caching on the client made easy through that system. It's transport agnostic, so HTTP is just one of many ways that you can get GraphQL from point A to point B. And it's self-documenting via introspection. More on that later. And GraphQL shines at scale in more ways than one. Transformative innovations like Apollo Federation offer a principled way for any number of teams to own individual services or subgraphs that compose into a single endpoint or supergraph via gateway server. Though GraphQL is a transformational technology, it's not without trade-offs. Most will say it's worth it. Some will say it's not. Some common pain points that people express include security, managing query complexity, caching, change management, and quote unquote versioning, though that's not quite the right way to frame it, and the learning curve. It's just a different set of assumptions working with a single graph instead of a bunch of resources. Many of these complaints are about solved problems at this point, and there are some amazing tools available now that offer increasingly sophisticated ways to govern your graph that cover a lot of these. But regardless of how informed or up to date these opinions are, they are sincerely held and not without merit. Just the other week, I was reading a Hacker News thread that had many of these talking points on it. Unsurprisingly, the discourse is very much of engineers, for engineers, and by engineers. And that's not a bad thing, it's just not complete. GraphQL is more than just the sum of its features and trade-offs. It can be the basis for a much more efficient operating model for modern teams across functions. We don't work alone. In my experience, product teams are cross-functional. Engineering might make up the plurality or majority of the team, but there are other roles too. Product managers, designers, project managers, scrum masters, product marketing managers, support, success, sales, UX researchers, QA, SDETs. I could go on. The title of this talk should give you a clue as to which of these folks I'll zoom in to talking about more. And the reason I want to talk about them is because GraphQL is one of those technologies, one of the few technologies, the impact of which can be felt outside engineering in a very, very tangible way. It addresses some real needs of the folks who work directly with engineers. And those needs are most clear in organizations that have reached a certain level of sophistication. When a company has only a handful of people, they're usually at a stage where there are a relatively small number of features to maintain for a relatively small core of users. They can focus a lot of time on greenfield development, moving things around to reflect the vision wherever that's coming from. If they're successful, one outcome is that they grow and grow and grow some more. And this is where your ability to ship new features runs into the bottleneck of maintaining the products and systems your users are already relying on. At the same time, growing organizations often use their resources to build out a team of professionals whose job it is to get to know users' needs and synthesize those with business goals to point the team in a given direction. Typically, that's a product manager. At the same time, they're filling out the ranks of engineering with folks who might have deep systems knowledge, but not necessarily product or domain context. And that creates an imbalance. There's an inflection point where the team's list of product priorities will start to outpace their ability to ship new features while keeping the lights on, much like the proverbial tortoise and hare. That's a healthy. It's a healthy thing, really. If you don't have a massive backlog of to-dos, are you really a software team? Still, I've seen that imbalance and that asymmetry be a source of friction on the team. And this can be especially true when the engineers have one boss, the PM has another, the designer has yet another, and so forth. A team of 10 could have 3 to 4 different managers up the chain. And even in a healthy organization with everyone acting in good faith, there's a hazard there. The details will differ from team to team. I'm sure many of you had experiences that broadly corroborate this, so I won't dwell on it. A single team reporting to multiple bosses could lead to valuable ideas, worthy trade-offs, and a great balance of priorities. It can also lead to competing incentives, even in the healthiest organizations. Again, these are some examples of questions that I've heard in some shape or form over the years. They're all valid questions, by the way. There's no shade here. The trade-offs that these questions imply can be the source of friction on cross-functional teams. Now, GraphQL can't solve all of these problems, but they can eliminate some of the practical obstacles that cause that friction, so you can do more of these in the same amount of time. So I'll invite all of us to use our imaginations for a bit and stipulate that we're on a product team working on a streaming app that resembles Spotify. I'm going to be using Apollo's what we call Spotify Showcase to show this. It uses the Spotify API under the hood, but transformed into a GraphQL service. Bear in mind, the rest of the talk will reference the Showcase app in some way, shape, or form. And I do intend for it to demonstrate concepts, not necessarily to solve problems for real streaming apps. So I would call this realistic fiction to illustrate my point, possibly with some plot holes, but it's here for demonstration purposes only. Without further ado, I'll just kind of show you what we're working with here. Hats off to Gerald Miller, who's on the call, who made this back in the winter to start proving out some concepts for Apollo Client 3.8. It's really been awesome to work with this. So here's the interface here. It should look familiar to anybody who's used this app before, Spotify that is. You can drill down into playlists. You can check out artists. You can look at their albums. You can look at individual songs, everything that you'd expect to be able to drill down into for an app like this. If there's time at the end, we can go into some more detail about it. But if you'd like to kind of do your own homework, this is available. It's MIT licensed at Apollo GraphQL / Spotify Showcase in GitHub. Seeing some love in the chat here. And a shout out for Joe Miller and Taylor Swift. Both great. So if you check in here, you'll see a little bit about it. It's running Apollo client on the front end along with React, and on the back end, there was an Apollo server instance that's behind a gateway known as Apollo router that's using Apollo's GraphOS platform under the hood. Pretty cool stuff. This is not necessarily about all of that, so I'm going to go ahead and get back to the slides. But shout out to the Spotify showcase. It's a lot of fun to be able to practice GraphQL and to use Apollo client and the Apollo platform in a non-trivial app that's also a lot of fun. So in a traditional sort of app structure where resources are accessed by making requests to different routes, you might see requests looking like this. This is sometimes referred to as REST or RESTful architecture, though those terms have strayed far from their original meaning, so I prefer to say resource-based architecture. Here's how an artist might be represented and accessed in this sort of paradigm. Should feel familiar. Likewise, here's a song, an album, and a playlist. My favorite playlist. And of course, the songs endpoint doesn't just have flat data about songs. It will have nested data about albums and artists, or it will require you to make waterfall requests to those resources. Playlists will have nested data about songs and artists, all that is interrelated and ultimately duplicative. This is a GraphQL meetup, so I'm sure you're all familiar with how GraphQL solves the problem of interrelated resources. It eliminates overfetching, enables client-side normalized caching, and so forth. But this is a talk about the whole cross-functional team, and this coupling of data shape to UI structure presents real problems for the team. So let's talk about a common scenario, the A/B test. You want to test the impact of a given feature, so you build it, you roll it out to a subset of users, and measure the performance against a control group of users with the old version. And so in our Spotify clone, we want to add more detail to a given screen. And that detail, let's stipulate, requires new data. Now, there are different universes where this happens, right, depending on the data. So in the Happy PM universe, first of all, we always start with a small talk. Then some key info about the A/B test is asked and answered. This is the ideal outcome of this conversation. Short cycle time for the PM, trivial data requirements for the engineer. Whether you're using GraphQL or not, it's easy to implement. The added at timestamp is just part of a table already being joined in the query that populates the JSON response for the playlist show action. And so your task list is pretty short. Running this experiment will not take much. Ship it. Whether you're using resource architecture or graph architecture. And in an alternate universe, sometimes the conversation goes like this. We've all had to be the bearer of bad news. The data needs might seem simple, right? But in reality, they are anything but. In this conversation, the PM hypothesizes that the date first listened to timestamp will boost engagement or NPS or what have you. The engineer knows that the data is costly, so there needs to be a lot of guardrails put into place. And that communication can be fraught, right? It's just one more field, right? And when you look at the task list, here you go, right? It's a longer task list. Note that there's conditional logic being introduced here on both the front end and back end in multiple places. And all that conditional logic is should be unit tested, right? So you're adding more code. We don't want this costly field first listened to at to be included everywhere. A song object is serialized. So we have to include it behind a query param or some other condition. Again, unit testing. That also means that cleanup needs to be done in multiple places on both the client and server once the experiment is run. That complexity slows down. You're involved in there, Alex.
Hey Jeff, you become really robotic.
Oh my goodness, is it still like that, or am I okay now?
I think it cleared off now.
All right, check 1, 2.
Yep, you're good.
Okay. All right, cool. I think I have a bad connection on my NSYNC lavalier mic here. So let me know if that happens again. Apologies, folks. Thank you, Derek. Here in bold and italics are the areas where, oh, did I say anything that was garbled before, like that I should repeat? Okay.
Well, the last couple sentences were all like garbled, robotic, but it's up to you. But
okay, yeah. Basically, the takeaway here is complexity slows down experimentation. If you have to set up and clean up an experiment in multiple places in your stack, you're just going to be creating work, which is something we need to contend with. And in bold and italics are the areas where GraphQL can help reduce the work that we need to do in order to run experiments more efficiently. It reduces the amount of places you need to make changes in order to accommodate A/B tests and other changes too. If your team has front-end and back-end specialists, all of a sudden you're freeing up back-end resources for higher value forward-thinking work. And here's like a super basic example just to illustrate the point that I'll do on this Spotify demo, Spotify Showcase app. So bear with me here, but again, this is a simplistic example, but one nonetheless. So we're going to go ahead and add this first listen to at timestamp here, and I'll just show you how like in the GraphQL document you can kind of just do that. So I'm going to go ahead and click on this playlist here. And I'm just going to note the ID. And I'll go into the Apollo Dev Tools here for a minute and just look it up in the cache so we can inspect the network response so I can show you later the difference. 2IS. I'm sure there's a faster way to do this, but I'm not super fluent with all the dev tools. So in our tracks, right, each node, right, just has a reference. And what I want to do is I want to add a first listen to at timestamp in here. So in my code, I'm gonna just go ahead and add that. And this experiment can happen completely in my GraphQL document and my front end code. It doesn't need to touch our backend code with conditional logic if it's already in our graph. So I'm going to go ahead first and go into our playlist table component and head down to our GraphQL document here. And I'm going to go ahead and add for each track a first listen to at timestamp. And because we noted that field is expensive, we're going to go ahead and use the default GraphQL directive include, which conditionally includes it if, and I'm just going to stipulate a variable here, experiment on. Simplistic example again, but one to just show the point of like encoding experiments at the query level and being able to use them in sparingly few places throughout your code base. So here we have a conditionally included first listen to at thing. So we're only doing it for experiment group. We don't want to go ahead and do a bunch of conditionals on our backend. We don't want to go ahead and include this for everybody, slowing down everybody's payloads and stressing our systems. I'm going to go ahead and go to the query now. I'm going to do to our route now where the query is. Include that here in our parameter list. It's a required Boolean. And of course, finally, just adding it to our variables here. So, in reality, we check the current user, right, and see if they're in the experiment cohort. We'll just hard code to true for proof of concept here. And of course, we generate our types. All right, green checks, that's a good thing. I know my colors, and that says good thing. And now if we go back in, we should be able to see in the same entity here in the cache when we go ahead and refresh. For our tracks, we should see that first listen to at playlist now for our experiment group. And so it's just a quick demonstration of like the notion of using this GraphQL document as the center of your like experiment logic, right? You can run your experiment in the same way. Another sometimes overlooked benefit, right, is that your experiment can be run in a similar fashion across all platforms without compromising on the design of your API or your various apps. So you're not letting the shape of the data or the shape of your UIs kind of dictate one for the other. And the result of all of this, and again, a simplistic example, but one that to prove the concept, is that in this timeline, the team had GraphQL. The engineer gets to have an easier conversation with their product colleague. And of course, the team thrives. Back to this slide. The takeaway here for the product manager is you don't want your data shape to be tightly coupled with the structure of your views or your platforms. It makes experimentation and innovation more costly and fragmented across your platforms. Noted GraphQL evangelist Henry Ford said this. I'm sure we're all familiar with the quote. Resources, or REST if you like, is the horse in this, and GraphQL is the car. Many people love horses, and horses are the superior choice for very certain niche situations. And as a side note, this is why I get a bit frustrated when folks compare technologies like TRPC to GraphQL. TRPC is a faster horse, in my opinion. It doubles down on the coupling of the structure of the UI to the structure of the backend. It's marvelous, it's delightful, and it's also subject to the same limitations as applications that rely on REST-like services or on a single platform, single language like TypeScript. And since we were on the subject of like experiments, cleanup is a first-class concept in GraphQL as well. The notion using the @deprecated A directive, for example, is a great way to mark what data is unsafe or ready to be unused. And so it's a great first-class part of the language to help with this experiment structure. So if you're on a product team, you're running a lot of bets on what users need, GraphQL has all these great things out of the box that you can use in order to move quicker and more safely. I'm going to skip this slide since I'm a little behind where I want to be. Again, though, this is broadly applicable to any member of the cross-functional team, but I found that this sort of angle appeals to folks like product managers or maybe scrum masters, project managers, what have you. It goes back around to the point that GraphQL is not just a pile of features. It's a way to change how your team operates for the better. Okay, so let's shift gears to a new scenario, redesign. Has anyone here, I guess, put your hand up if you've ever implemented a redesign of an existing view? And our cameras are off because it's a virtual meetup. I'm imagining a room full of folks with their hands up. And please do, everybody, I see some emoji hand raises already. Thank you, Matza. And keep your hands up if that redesign didn't include any changes to the information being shown on the screen, right? Nothing is sacred in a redesign. Many times, thank you all for raising your virtual hands. I do appreciate it. Many times the entire interface is rethought from first principles, right? And it's also true that in a growing team or in a recently reorganized team, whatever the scenario may be in 2023, it's frequently the case that the redesign is being done by someone who didn't have a hand in the existing design. They don't have the context in mind. Design is a cognitively demanding task that requires long periods of focus. It's not unlike software engineering in that designers gather prior art, spike out some things, write proofs of concept, ask around, etc. It's not just an iterative process where you only take what's there and refactor. That's an option, but not the only one. And I want to double underline this last bullet point on the screen. Asking questions is costly. This is especially true on a distributed team, particularly when there's a time zone asymmetry. It can feel kind of like this, right? You're looking for an answer, you're in the flow, you need to know what something means. You need to know if all playlists have images in Spotify, in our Spotify clone. And you get this answer. Now put yourselves in the shoes of the designer. That can be a frustrating position to be in. And this is the sad truth. We often are the bottleneck for conveying what data is available and the meaning of that data to our teammates. The newer the designer is to the team, the product or feature, the more precarious the situation is. I've seen design reviews go very poorly because engineering and design were not in sync as to what was possible and not possible to show to users with the data available or to have users do. I believe strongly this was because of this sort of de facto gatekeeper function. It's a source of friction that makes the design process slower and prone to human error. And it's such a trivial thing when you think about it. Consider how valuable a designer and an engineer's time is. As a manager myself, it's sad to imagine how much collaboration time is squandered on a task that should really be self-service and on demand. I'm going to skip this slide mostly for time's sake, but the idea here is like designers are going to self-serve no matter what, and they might self-serve through clicking around the app and making assumptions based on what they see. Looking at this, for example, all these playlists do have art. So I might assume that playlists do have art here. It's not a safe assumption. It's not a super realistic one, but I'm just illustrating the point. You can substitute in whatever experience from in your minds from your careers. I'm sure everybody's got a story that's somewhat like that over their career. And to be clear, this is a solvable problem. And many teams have found strategies that'll work for them, right? Documentation. Open API, for example, aka Swagger, is a great solution for any JSON API. You can give people access to your API docs that way, and they can self-serve in that manner. And any number of ad hoc solutions work too. Some folks make their, a Jira page, Confluence page, or a Confluence page, with it, but they share the same limitation, and that is that they're stapled onto your API after the fact, and are therefore fragile. They're only one sort of to-do away of being put on the back burner and kind of forgotten about after a while. Added to the Jira pile, right? I'm sure this room already knows how powerful GraphQL introspection can be to address this issue, and I'll quote from the spec here. Documentation is a first-class feature of GraphQL type systems. To ensure the documentation of a GraphQL service remains consistent with its capabilities, descriptions of GraphQL definitions are provided alongside their definitions and made available via introspection. To allow GraphQL service designers to easily publish documentation alongside the capabilities of a GraphQL service, GraphQL descriptions are defined using the Markdown syntax. I'm going to skip a few things. GraphQL schema and all other definitions which can be described should provide a description, unless they're considered self-descriptive, end quote. And you can just see in this Ruby code snippet, right, how ergonomic the documentation can be for the developer, depending on the server technology you're using. Writing a linter rule, for example, for this could be trivial to enforce, good documentation. And geez, it even supports Markdown. That's awesome. And there are so many great tools out there for exploring GraphQL schema. Graphical is amazing and permissively licensed. GraphQL Playground is widely used. Apollo GraphOS contains both the Explorer and Field Insights as part of Apollo Studio. The discoverability and searchability of the data there is really great. And I'll give you just a quick look here. It's Apollo Studio. I'm in the Fields tab. And I've already actually done a search for a playlist, but I'll do it again just for, like, for example, if I'm this designer, I want to know about playlists. I'm going to find the playlist type when I search for it. And I can even see, oh, images. That sounds like what I was looking for. And there's a description here. It's ended with ellipses, so I'm going to go ahead and go into my field insights. The engineer here, your eyes might be drawn over here to seeing how many requests are here and checking out all the great executions and everything like that that you see here. Latency distributions, that's awesome. But over here is where I'm looking in the description. And I could see images for the playlist. The array may be empty or contain up to 3 images. So light bulb, right? Designer not only answers their own question, hey, there could be no album art, but also, hey, I'm looking closer. This is actually 4 pieces of album art that are stacked against each other. Oh, wait, I should probably design for that. Is sort of self-service is a really important part of a high-functioning team that's able to share context on demand without interruptions. A similar functionality you can get through Apollo Explorer, which is similar to graphical in many ways. So if you find like the playlist type, for example, here too, which is searchable, you can get the same information. It'll deep link to Studio, but it'll also if you just look in here, you can see inline the description of these. So it's just a feature of the language that I think is really helpful for teams. Now, there's no reason why you can't give the whole team access to tooling that empowers them to explore the full capabilities of your system. Whether it's an Apollo product or one of the many other capable tools out there, GraphQL is designed with documentation in mind. It's not a perfect system. Things can still fall through the cracks if an engineer neglects to update descriptions, but you'll never document an unavailable field or have out-of-date docs that reference a field that was subsequently removed. And that's a big part of the battle. And for the Figma stands in the house, there's a neat little plugin that enables designers to pipe live data from a GraphQL service into Figma. I'm going to do a really quick look at it because I think it's fun and something for the designers. So here's a version or a Figma of the Spotify showcase that I piped in here using a very handy plugin called HTML2 Design. It takes HTML and then can make a Figma out of it. Pretty magical. This plugin, though, that I wanted to show was GraphQL Data Fill, which actually pulls up a graphical instance right in here, and you can run live queries in here against an endpoint. Here's one. I'm using, by the way, a public GraphQL service that's available on the internet for simplicity's sake, so I don't have to deal with any of the setup for like headers and things like that. So even though this is the Spotify showcase stuff, I'm going to be piping data about React conferences in here, so bear with me. Although React Finland 2018 is a great song title, so I would absolutely listen to that. Anyway, back in here, if you wanted to go ahead and import data, and it actually supports iteration too, but I'm going to keep it simple. You just use like a template syntax here. So I'm going to write conference.name into my Figma. And then if I run the plugin again, grab that data from here, it should pre-fill. Yeah, there we go. So now we're listening to React Finland 2018. Again, a trivial example and a fun little plugin. I just thought that was interesting. Again, broadly true for anyone who wants to know what data your UI has access to, and hopefully that's a lot of people. You want documentation as a first-class feature. You want fewer interruptions for higher quality designs and reviews and great tooling. Let's wrap it up. GraphQL is not just a tool for engineers. It's not even, as some popular developer influencers say, a way to solve communication problems between engineering teams, though it can help with that. GraphQL offers concrete operational benefits for a modern cross-functional team. It helps your designers self-serve so they can create high-quality designs faster, helps your PM with cycle times that can be measured in weeks instead of months. Once you adopt GraphQL and you've made the switch, the trade-offs involved with engineering come with unambiguous benefits that are tangible to PMs and designers, not just abstracted away as part of the development process. I'll admit, again, the examples shared today were basic. They were quote unquote realistic fiction, but it really is the basics of the language that make it so impactful for both ourselves and our colleagues. I'm really eager for your feedback on this talk, so please do come find me on the internet at Jeff Auriemma on Twitter or X or whatever, and at jeff.auriemma on Threads. And let's chat about what worked and what didn't. I want to acknowledge Bill. Thank you for organizing. Anthony, looking forward to your talk in a minute. Gerald, for creating the Spotify showcase you saw today, and the Apollo client team also did a bunch of cool stuff in there. Gerard Lemuse is the creator of the GraphQL data fill plugin you saw a few moments ago. And I don't know who made fakemessenger.com, but I used their fake text threads in here a bit. So I wanted to just give a tip of the hat to them.